There's been something that I've worried about for quite a while now, primarily involving games. Namely, the question of what happens when the servers go down. Now, some people might think this is a bit paranoid, as servers for many games or even entire consoles have gone down in the past. So before we truly begin, let's discuss a brief history of this practice. I think the earliest practice of this that could be well and truly considered to have servers with actual exclusive games and content has to have been the Satellaview add-on from 1995 for the Super Famicom, only in Japan, which means that this isn't a very new phenomenon. However, most of the content from there was grabbed and manages to be emulated to this very day. Hell, most of it has even been translated. A note from editing dabhdude here. Turns out I'm an idiot, and that there was still quite a bit of content that was lost from this service. I think it's ironic that this just drives the point home even more so, since it goes to show that having your games or exclusive content locked behind online connectivity is a really bad idea. So, okay, what else? Well, we didn't really see the advent of these online games and servers as we know them now until the 2000s, so why don't we fast forward a bit? The obvious and biggest example I can think of from the early 2000s has to be Phantasy Star Online. Except, wait, that too has been made to work with other servers. See, that's going to become a running theme here. Sure, while the servers are down, the games were either designed in a way where them going offline didn't mean you could never play them again, fans managed to reverse engineer them, or just got the source code to run server emulators handed to them, or there either wasn't an online component to the game, or it was such a small thing that it doesn't majorly impact the game. Oh, but wait, I'm forgetting stuff like the original Xbox Live. Oh, we'll get to that. But for now, let's move on to the mid-2000s. The Wii was a massive success, and it had several online components, which luckily we can still access. Uh-oh. Yeah, this is where things really started to kick off. Sure, things weren't great before, but now you're starting to get entire games or components of systems that just sort of don't work anymore. Now here's the first time I'm going to acknowledge Nintendo's unique situation. Especially for older consoles, Nintendo's security was lackluster enough that it allowed for fans to reverse engineer or archive things. Reconnect 24 exists for most Wii Connect 24 things, Wii MMF5 for most of the Wii and DS games that used Wi-Fi connection, and basically everything that came from the Wii Shop channel was basically just a WAD file which you can just download from different sites and install on the homebrewed Wii. Which, okay, side note here, if you have a Wii or Wii U, why haven't you soft modded it yet? Despite all the warnings you might get about it, if you follow the directions properly, it's honestly fairly idiot-proof. And no, before you ask, Nintendo isn't going to break your door down for daring to mod your Wii. So yeah, mainly through fan efforts and general circumstances, the Wii basically never went offline. The same cannot be said, however, for the original Xbox. The original Xbox, and namely the Xbox Live component, has been offline since 2010, and has only just recently gotten some reasonable compatibility back through fan efforts in order to get it back online. This is the kind of stuff I'm worried about, where a company with, let's face it, more competent security practices decides it's time to shut down a service. Although even with this, you have to remember that the original Xbox was still a mostly offline console with mostly offline games. No, the real trouble starts in the next generation of games. So we arrive much closer to the present, and this is where my issues truly begin. For you see, beginning with this generation of consoles, and especially with the next, this is where updates to actual games started coming in, where you had your day one patches and DLC. So this has now become a problem that goes beyond just online games, and has developed into a problem with most games at this point. You see, a lot of developers have started becoming rather lazy, to a point where some games feel more like you're playing an open beta instead of a finalized product. Because, hey, if there's a problem, just shove a patch out the door. However, this is my concern. Sometimes in games there will be so many bugs that the only way to play it properly is to have the patch installed. Right now, that's perfectly fine, since most of these update servers are still active. But what about in the future? I don't know how often games are reprinted on discs with the latest patches. I know some companies just don't bother with it, and even for the ones that do, it seems most sales happen within the first couple months. So cool, it's great that there are updates, and it's always good to have physical copies of these games, but if most people with said physical copy also have the day one release, or most copies that exist in general contain the original release or maybe the first update but not much else, then that will cause major problems in the future. And DLC is an entire issue in and of itself. Considering many games now release half finished, what will happen once DLC is just completely unavailable? And oh yeah, digitally purchased games are just a disaster waiting to happen. Ironically enough, I think that PC users have the greatest risk with this, but also the greatest opportunities for mitigating these issues. Think about it. What's the most popular platform to buy PC games on? Steam, of course. And if you play PC games, when was the last time you purchased a physical PC game? Do they even sell them like that anymore? And for some digital games, they just forego the disc entirely and just hand you a download code, which is certainly very future-proof. Now mind you, Valve has super pinky promised that if things start going down, that they'll release a tool that will bypass Steam's DRM for games which utilize it. And yeah, that's a great promise. But at the same time, plenty of companies will try to pretend that nothing's wrong until it becomes too big to ignore, and then suddenly the company is gone. So what you essentially have to do in this scenario is trust that Valve will keep their word. And as we all know, Valve is great at keeping their word and keeping to a timetable. Or hey, what about even old operating systems? Yeah, sure, Steam and Valve still exist, but if your game only runs on Windows XP, yeah, sorry, Steam lost support for Windows XP back in 2019. But hey, that's the good side of things. This is the optimistic approach, because Valve, despite all their faults, is generally more pro-consumer than most game companies. There are plenty of companies out there which will shut down multiplayer games and say, hey, go buy the sequel or shut up. Or sometimes it's even, oh, too bad. There are even some companies who will try to sue anyone who attempts to recreate the servers they shut down, which were the only way to play the game you bought with money. Although hey, speaking of fan servers and projects, let's talk about those. Unlike the companies mentioned prior, there is no guarantee of anything here. This is very much the Wild West. Sure, it's great that Wii MMF5, for example, is preserving the online functions of most of these games, but what happens when that server goes down, or another project goes down? This is nowhere near as ridiculous as it may sound, whether because hosting and server costs get too expensive, or because there are life situations which cause things to fall apart due to being put on the back burner, or hey, what if the person running some of these projects dies? They die in a car crash or something. Best case scenario, the code was out there already, so someone else could restart it just by using the pre-existing code. Sure, this would be a hassle, especially if there isn't enough coordination and 20 people are trying to do this all at once, and because IPs for these projects would be different and thus require repatching everything. But not only to avoid this issue, but also to avoid the cases where the code isn't as readily available, I think what's needed is an order of succession. If something happens, then all the responsibilities are passed on to someone else, with such succession list being checked on every year or two, and if necessary, updated. Now, one might say this entire discussion is unneeded or even over the top, but I disagree, because it wouldn't surprise me that these fan projects become more prevalent, not less. Let's take the best case example here and pretend that somehow all of these companies continue to provide these updates to their old back catalog. That's a highly unrealistic scenario, and they're one merger or management change away from removing that option. A more practical scenario? Yeah, sorry pal, we pulled any online content, including multiplayer servers or downloads for updates or DLC, offline. In that instance, the best you could hope for would be a fan project dedicated to keeping these types of things alive. And while that's not to say it won't happen for some, perhaps even many games, let's face it, it won't happen for all of them. Some games will just inevitably be left behind, whether because not as many people care about it, or because some security measures were put in place to ensure that users couldn't get updates from different servers, or the updates simply couldn't be extracted at all for redistribution. This is something that has concerned me and will continue to do so. Sure, we could talk all day about always online games, which are definitely bad, but at least there you generally know what you've gotten yourself into, even if having a game be always online for a few special features in an otherwise single player game is just stupid, or even worse for DRM purposes, because screw that. Now, DRM sucks. This is a problem everywhere, honestly. Whether because a console locks down their game so that it is only supposed to work on their system, or the type we'll be talking about here, online DRM, which is used especially on PC. The problem with this is pretty obvious, and it's been gone over many times in the past. Always online DRM is horrifying because, especially depending on the implementation, you may have to be online for the entire time you play the game. What's that? The DRM servers have gone down for your single player game? Well, you either get to pirate the game that you bought, or you have a $60 paperweight. Isn't DRM just wonderful? Or hey, it doesn't even have to be online DRM. Even offline DRM can screw you over. Let's say you have an original copy of Sonic Heroes for PC. Now then, do you have a Windows XP machine still around somewhere? What's that? You don't? Well, too bad. It looks like you aren't playing your game, since the DRM used in this game is actively blocked by newer versions of Windows. The only way to play your game is to get a cracked copy of it. But hey, it could be worse. There were some DRM implementations which could actually do damage to your computer or wipe out your data. Aren't you glad to know that companies feel the need to treat people like this all because of the possibility that someone will pirate their games? Only for years down the road that piracy becomes the only way people can reliably play it. Thanks guys, you've literally given the pirates the better experience, since once they've cracked the game, they don't have to deal with this nonsense. There's way more that could be said about this practice, but honestly, I think Overlord Gaming made a great video on this topic, so I highly recommend you check out their video if you want to learn more about this. Link is in the description if you would like to check that out. What about other games though? Games where you didn't even realize this would be an issue until one day you try to boot up a game you haven't played in a while, or have never played before, only to find out you can't play it because the game was released half finished, and any updates or DLC to finish it are long gone. That is why I'm asking this question. That is why I'm asking, what happens after the servers go down? And the answer is that I don't fully know. What I do know is that a lot of stuff will end up being lost, and that will be a shame. Well, thank y'all for watching, and take care.
Thank you.